Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Digital Exchange. This is the podcast that I sit down with C-level IT leaders and talk about what is working and not working within their roles. I touch specifically on how Microsoft is affecting their companies and the decisions they have to make around those Microsoft products. Today, I'm doing a solo episode because I want to talk about something that I've been noticing. Microsoft has quietly become one of the largest line items in most organizations. It's not just inside IT, but across the entire business. And what's interesting is most of us didn't really notice when that shift happened. It wasn't one big change. It was gradual. It was a license here, an add-on there, security, compliance, teams, storage, Power BI, and now AI layered on top of that. And before you know it, it's become a meaningful number for organizations. But here's the part I've been thinking about more recently. If you take a step back and ask a simple question, and the question is, why is this number increasing every year? Most organizations don't have a clean answer. They don't have a confident answer. They don't have something you can walk into a budget conversation and explain clearly without having any caveats to the conversation. And I don't think that's because teams are mismanaging it. I think it's because the environment itself has changed. It's different from it was years ago. Licensing isn't static anymore. It used to be a lot more predictable. You had agreements, you had exact counts, you had a sense of stability. But now it's different. Now it's layered, it's dynamic, and it's constantly evolving as we go along. And I think a lot of teams are doing their best to keep up with that, but the visibility hasn't kept pace with the complexity. So today, I just want to talk through that. I want to not from a technical standpoint, but let's talk from more of a practical one. Let's talk more about what's actually happening, why it feels harder to manage than it should, and why even well-run organizations are struggling to get a clear handle on it. When you look how Microsoft spend grows inside an organization, it's rarely intentional. I don't think that anybody in an organization is sitting there saying, hey, you know what? Let's increase this by 20% this year. It happens in smaller increments. What happens is you'll onboard new employees. A license gets added. You roll out security improvements, more licenses. You adopt new tools, Teams, Power Platform, maybe some compliance features. Then there are add-ons. You now AI on top of everything else. Each decision makes sense on its own. Individually, they're reasonable, but collectively, they compound. And over time, you end up with a number that's much larger than what you originally expected. And it's not because of one decision, but because of 100 small ones. And the challenge is those decisions aren't always tracked in a way that tells a clear story later on. So when you look back, it's kind of hard to connect the dots. I think that most organizations feel like they have a decent handle on their environment. Maybe yes, maybe no. You can go in, you can pull some reports. You can see your license counts. You can go get some usage data. Not very easily, but you can get some. But when you really break it down, there's a difference between having data and having clarity. You might know how many licenses you have. You might know what are you paying. You might know what's assigned. But I tell you what, the harder questions are who actually needs what they have? What's being underutilized? What's driving real productivity versus just sitting there doing nothing? And that's where things start getting less clear. Because I won't lie to you, because the data does exist, but it's not always connected in a way that supports the ability to make good decisions. So you end up with partial visibility. You end up with enough just to operate, but you really don't have enough to feel confident in making any real change at scale. And I personally think there are a few reasons that this has become more difficult over the last couple of years. And one of them, I think, is just the pace of change, the pace things are moving. Microsoft is constantly evolving the platform. There's always new features. There's new bundles. There's new pricing structures. And it's not just one product. it happens across their entire ecosystem. The second thing to think about is the shift towards more of a dynamic pricing model. It's not just before we used to have fixed license. It's not that way anymore. It varies, it changes, and that makes forecasting harder. And the third, and everybody experienced now, and probably the biggest, is AI. AI is now adding another layer of cost, but also another layer of decision making that we have to have. Decisions like who gets access, what level, and what's the expected return on what we're doing. And those aren't simple decisions. They're not just technical. They're tied to how the business operates. So now you're not just managing licenses. You're making decisions that impact productivity, cost, and the long-term strategy for the organization. And all of that's happening on top of an already complex environment that you're dealing with. And I think where all of this really comes to the focus is in conversation with finance, because at some point the question will come up, and the question is, why is this increasing? And you know what? It's a fair question. From a finance perspective, they're actually looking for predictability, justification, and alignment to the business outcomes. And from the IT side, you understand the environment. You understand why the decisions were made. But now translating that into clear and concise explanations is not always straightforward, especially when the visibility you have is just not complete. So what happens is this: the conversation becomes reactive. You pull together what you can, you explain the major drivers. Hey, sounds familiar? You justify the direction, but it's not always as clean as it could be. And I think that is where a lot of the friction comes from. It's not because either side is wrong, but it's the clarity needed to line both sides. It just isn't always there, and that's a problem. I think it's easier to frame this as a cost issue, but I don't think that's the core problem. Most organizations are really not looking to cut Microsoft. It's not really about cost. Microsoft is too embedded in how the business operates. The real issue is this. The real issue is confidence. It's confidence in what you're spending, confidence in why you're spending it, and confidence in whether it's aligned to actual usage and value to the organization. Because without that confidence, every decision feels a little uncertain. There's a pause to it. You hesitate to make changes. You wind up defaulting to staying close to what you already have, and you avoid risk. And you know what? Over time, that will lead to inefficiencies. It's not because people aren't capable, but most of the time, because the system just really doesn't support confident decision making, and that's very important. I tell you, the organizations that I seem to handle this better aren't necessarily doing anything dramatic in what they're doing. What they've just done is they've just shifted how they think about it. They don't treat licensing as something they review once a year. They treat it as something that's ongoing. It's something they continuously understood. They're always looking at it. They focus on keeping visibility current. They focus on aligning licenses to actual roles and usage, which is very important. They focus on making small adjustments over time instead of making big changes under pressure. So by the time renewal time comes around, they're not scrambling to figure things out. They already have a clear picture of what's going on. And you know what that does? That helps make decisions a lot more simpler for them. Again, it's not easy, but it's clearer, and that's very important. So when you step back and really take a look at all of this, I don't think the challenge that Microsoft is too expensive or that organizations are making poor decisions. I think the challenge is that environments has evolved faster than the way we manage them. It's become more dynamic. It's become more layered. It's become more connected to the business than it used to be. And the visibility needed to support that, it really has not fully caught up. So the result we're having is we have good teams making reasonable decisions without always having a full clarity behind them. And that's what creates the friction. That's what makes budget conversations harder. And that's what leads to a lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty really shows itself at renewal time. It's not a lack of capability, it's a lack of clear, connected insights. I think the opportunity here isn't to overhaul everything. That's not what we're trying to accomplish here. It's to improve how we understand what's already there. So decisions feel less reactive and it becomes more intentional in what you do. I'm kind of curious how others thinks about this. Are you confident in how you're managing Microsoft spend today? Or does it still feel like something's harder to fully get your arms around than it should be? And I think a lot of people are feeling that way. Well, those are my thoughts for today. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you at the next episode.